Is this thing on? Okay. Give me just 1 second here. Okay. Good evening. Actually, I just realized I forgot my water. One more minute, okay? Okay. Good evening. Good evening. Welcome to the stream. Okay. So, as you can tell, we have a different color for the lighting tonight. And you might wonder why. That is because we are starting a new book tonight. We have finished the last book, The Call of Cthulhu, and we are now moving on to a different one. That would be another H.P. Lovecraft book, the Randolph Carter Tales. And this is one, I don't know if it's one of the lesser known H.P. Lovecraft stories, but it is not quite as famous as Call of Cthulhu and other stories like Mountains of Madness and Dagon, other stories, you know. But here, I think I'm actually may be a little too loud. Okay. Yeah. So to preface this whole book, to me, this Randolph Carter character seems to be a bit of a self-insert of H.P. Lovecraft into his own storytelling. It's just kind of a bit obvious based on some of the characteristics that he gives this character. Like, he's a, I guess, underappreciated, if not failed author, which at the time of H.P. Lovecraft's living, he was, for for lack of a better word, a bit failed, and nobody really took him quite seriously or recognized his work as being substantial. It was only that we, after his death, we posthumously kind of recognized how good of his storytelling was, and also being this character is from New England, which H.P. Lovecraft was as well, and he just had an odd, both the character and the author just had an odd sense about them, just very eccentric people. So I think this was his way of putting himself in the universe without actually, explicitly putting himself in the universe. It's just, but I mean, it's kind of obvious. Give me just a moment. Okay. Let me... Sorry, I'm trying to share the link for tonight's stream. Okay. So, the way that we will tackle this is a bit confusing and complicated. So the first story, let's see, let me take a look at how many pages this is. So this first story is going to be over 100 pages long, and I do not think that I will tackle the whole thing tonight. So I am going to have to split this one specific story into two parts, which that's the way it will go. But I'm sure you guys understand. It would be a bit difficult for anybody to sit on a stream in a very hot and stuffy room reading 113 pages worth of storytelling. So that would be hard for anybody, but just bear with me. So, without further ado. Oh, sorry. Tonight we have a new drink. This would be and I'm going to give a shout out to one of my friends, Luke Byler. This is, if I understand correctly, your favorite drink. I'll have to make one for you sometime because it's probably the best you'll ever have. This is a Amaretto Sour. It's got cherry, some sweet and sour mix, of syrup, some amaretto liquor, and I mean, you can put a few different things in it, like lemonade or soda. I just went with lemonade, but yes, have not tried it. Let's see. It's good stuff. very tart. This definitely is a good summer drink, and it is peak summer right now. So, okay. The recipe is in the description for anybody interested in making an Amaretto Sour at home. Okay. So this very long and challenging story is called The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath. 3 times Randolph Carter dreamed of the marvelous city, and 3 times was he snatched away while he still paused on the high terrace above it, all golden and lovely it blazed in the sunset, with walls, temples, colonnades, and arched bridges of veined marble, silver basined fountains on prismatic spray in the broad squares and perfumed gardens, and wide streets marching between delicate trees and blossom-laden urns, and ivory statues in gleaming rows, while on steep northward slopes climbed tiers of red roofs and old peaked gables, harboring little lanes of grassy cobbles. It was a fever of the gods, a fanfare of supernal trumpets, and a clash of immortal cymbals. Mystery hung about it, as clouds about a fabulous unvisited mountain, and as Carter stood breathless and expectant on that of a balustrated parapet where there swept up to him the poignancy and suspense of almost vanished memory, the pain of lost things, and the maddening need to place again what was once an awesome and momentous place. He knew that for him its meaning must have been supreme, though in what cycle or incarnation had he known it, or whether in a dream or in waking, he could not tell. Vaguely, it called up glimpses of far-forgotten first youth, when wonder and pleasure lay in all mystery of days, and dawn and dusk alike strode forth prophetic in the eager sound of lutes and song, unclosing fairy gates toward further and surprising marvels. But each night, as he stood on the high marble terrace with curious urns and carven rail, and looked off over the hushed sunset city of beauty and unearthly eminence, he felt the bondage of dream's tyrannous gods, for in no wise could he leave that lofty spot, or descend the wide memorial flights flung endlessly down to where those streets of elder witchery lay outspread and beckoning. When, for the 3rd time, he awaked, with the flights still undescended, and those hushed sunset streets still untraversed, he prayed long and earnestly to the hidden gods of dream that brood capricious above clouds of unknown Kadath, in the cold waste where no man tread. But the gods made no answer, and shewed no relenting, nor did they give any favoring sign when he prayed to them in dream, and invoked them sacrificially through bearded priests Nash and Kamanta, whose through the cavern temple, with its pillar of flame, lies not far from the gates of the waking world. It seemed, however, that his prayers must have been adversely heard, for after the first of them he ceased wholly to behold the marvelous city, as if 3 glimpses from afar had been mere accidents or oversights, and against some hidden plan or wish of the gods. At length, sick with the longing for those glittering sunset streets and cryptical hill lanes among the ancient tilled roofs, nor able sleeping or waking to drive them from his mind, Carter resolved to go into bold entreaty whither no man had gone before, and dare the icy deserts through the dark where unknown Kadath, veiled in cloud and crowned through unimagined stars, holds secret and nocturnal the onyx castle of the Great Ones. Glad to hear it, Amanda. Thank you. In white slumber, he descended on 70 steps to the cavern of flame, and talked of this design to the bearded priest of Nasht in Kamanta. And the priest shook their I don't know if that's a real word, Schvint-bearing heads, and vowed it would be the death of his soul. They pointed out that the Great Ones had shewn already their wish, and that it is not agreeable to them that he be harassed in their insistent pleas. They reminded him, too, that not only had no man ever been to unknown Kadath, but no man had ever suspected in what part of space it may lie, whether it be in the dreamlands around our world, or in those surrounding some unguessed companion of Formalt or Aldebaran. If in our dreamland, it might conceivably be reached, but only 3 fully human souls, since the time began, had ever crossed and recrossed back the black impious gulfs to other dreamlands. And of that 3, 2 had come back quite mad. There were, in such voyages, incalculable local dangers, as well as that shocking final peril which gibbers unmentionably outside the ordered universe, where no dreams reach, the last amorphous bright and nethermost confusion which blasphemes and bubbles at the center of all infinity. The boundless demon Sultan Azathoth, whose name no lips dare speak aloud, and who gnaws hungrily in inconceivable unlighted chambers beyond time amidst the muffled, maddening beating of the vile drums and the thin, monotonous whine of the accursed flutes, to which detestable pounding and piping dance slowly, awkwardly, and absurdly in the gigantic ultimate gods, the blind, voiceless, tenebrous, mindless other gods, whose soul and messenger is the crawling chaos Nyarlathotep. Of these things was Carter warned by the priest Nasht in Kamanta, in the cavern of flame, but still he resolved to find the gods on unknown Kadath in the cold waste, wherever that might be, and to win from them a sight and remembrance from shelter of the marvelous sunset city. He knew that his journey would be a strange and long, and that the Great Ones would be against it, but being old in the land and the dream, he counted on many useful memories and devices to aid him. So asking a farewell blessing of the priests, and thinking shrewdly on his course, he boldly descended the 700 steps to the gate of deeper slumber, and set out through the enchanted wood. In the tunnels of that twisted wood, whose low, prodigious oaks twine groping boughs, and shine dim with the phosphorescence of the strange fungi, dwell the furtive and secret Zoogs, who know many obscure secrets of the dream world and few of the waking world, since the wood at 2 places touches the lands of men, though it would be disastrous to say where. Certain unexplained rumors, events, and vanishments occur among men where the Zoogs have access, and it is well that they cannot travel far outside the world of dream, but over the nearest parts of the dream world they pass freely, flitting small and brown and unseen, and bearing back piquant tales to beguile the hours around their hearths in the forest they love. Most of them live in barrows, but inhabit the trunks of great trees, and although they live mostly on fungi, it is muttered that they have also a slight taste for meat, either physical or spiritual, for certainly many dreamers have entered that wood who have not come out. Carter, however, had no fear, for he was an old dreamer and had learnt their fluttering language and made many a treaty with them, having found through their help the splendid city of Selphais, on Uth Nargai, beyond the Tenarian hills, where reigns half the year the great King Kurans, a man he had known by another name in life. Kurans was the one soul who had been to the star gulfs and returned free from madness. Threading now the low phosphorescent aisles between those gigantic trunks, Carter made fluttering sounds in the manner of the Zoogs, and listened now and then for responses. He remembered one particular village of the creatures near the center of the wood, where a circle of great mossy stones in what was once a clearing tells of older and more terrible dwellers long forgotten, and toward this spot he hastened. He traced his way by the grotesque fungi, which always seem better nourished as one approaches the dread circle where elder beings danced and sacrificed. Finally, the greater light of those thicker fungi revealed a sinister green and gray vastness, pushing up through the roof of the forest and out of sight. This was the nearest of the great ring of stones, and Carter knew he was close to the Zoog village. Renewing his fluttering sound, he waited patiently, and was at length rewarded by an impression of many eyes watching him. It was the Zoogs, for one sees their weird eyes long before one can discern their small, slippery brown outlines. Out they swarmed from hidden burrow and honeycombed tree, till the whole dim-lit region was alive with them. Some of the wilder ones brushed Carter unpleasantly, and one even nipped loathsomely at his ear. But these lawless spirits were soon restrained by their elders. The council of sages, recognizing their visitor, offered a gourd of fermented sap from a haunted tree unlike any others, which had grown from a seed dropped down by someone on the moon. And as Carter drank it ceremoniously, a very strange colloquy began. The Zoogs did not, unfortunately, know where the peak of Kadath lies, nor could they even say whether the cold waste is in our dream world or in another. Rumors of the Great Ones came equally from all points, and one might say they were likelier to be seen on high mountain peaks than in valleys, since on such peaks they dance reminiscently where the moon is above and the clouds beneath. Then one very ancient Zoog recalled a thing unheard of by the others. It said that in Ulthar, beyond the river Sky, where still linger the last copy of those inconceivably old Penotic manuscripts made by waking men in forgotten boreal kingdoms, and born into the land of dreams when the hairy cannibal Gnofex overcame many templed Elothe and slew all the heroes of the land of Lomar. Those manuscripts, he said, told much of the gods, and besides, in Ulthar there were men who had seen signs of the gods, and even one old priest who had scaled a great mountain to behold them dancing in moonlight. He had failed, through his companion, had succeeded, and perished namelessly. So Randolph Carter thanked the Zoogs, who fluttered amicably and gave him another gourd of the moon tree wine to take with him, and set out through the phosphorescent wood for the other side, where the rushing sky flows down upon the slopes of Larian, and Hotheg and Near and Ulthar dot the plain. Behind him, furtive and unseen, crept several of the curious Zoogs, for they wished to learn what might befall him and bear back the legend to their people. The vast oaks grew thicker as he pushed beyond the village, and he looked sharply for certain a spot where they would then thin somewhat, standing quite dead or dying amongst the unnaturally dense fungi and the rotting mold and mushy logs of their fallen brothers. There he would turn sharply aside, for that spot, a mighty slab of stone, rests on the forest floor, and those who had ever dared approach it say it bears an iron ring 3 feet wide, remembering the archaic circle of great mossy rocks, and what it was probably set up for. The Zoogs do not pause near that expansive slab with its huge ring, for they realize that all which is forgotten need not necessarily be dead, and they would not like to see the slab rise slowly and deliberately. Carter detoured at the proper place and heard behind him the frightened fluttering of some more timid zoogs. He had known they would follow him, so he was not disturbed, for one grows accustomed to the anomalies of prying creatures. It was twilight when he came to the edge of the wood, and the strengthening glow told him it was twilight morning. Over fertile plains rolling down from the sky, he saw the smoke of cottage chimneys, and on every hand were the hedges and plowed fields of thatched roofs and of a peaceful land. Once he stopped at a farmhouse well for a cup of water, and all the dogs barked affrightedly of the inconspicuous zoogs that crept through the grass behind. At another house, where there were people stirring, he asked questions about the gods, and whether they danced often upon Larian, but the farmer and his wife would only make the elder sign and tell him to the way of Nir and Ulthar. At noon, he walked through one broad high street of Nir, which he had at once visited, and which marked the farthest former travels in his direction. And soon afterward, he came to the great stone bridge across the sky, into whose central pier the masons had sealed a living human sacrifice when they built it 1,300 years before. Once on the other side, the frequent presence of cats, who all arched their backs at the trailing zoogs, revealed the near neighborhood of Ulthar. For in Ulthar, according to an ancient and significant law, no man may kill a cat. Very pleasant were the suburbs of Ulthar, with their little green cottages and neatly fenced farms, and still pleasanter the quaint town itself, with its old peaked roofs and overhanging upper stories, and numberless chimney pots, and narrow hill streets, where one can see old cobbles whenever graceful cats afford space enough. Carter, the cats being somewhat dispersed by the half-seen zoogs, picked his way directly to the modest temple of the Elder Ones, where the priests and old records were said to be. And once within the venerable circular tower of ivied stone, which crowns Ulthar's highest hill, he sought out the patriarch, Atal, who had been up at the forbidden peak Hatheg Kla in the stony desert and had come down once again alive. Sorry, I just realized that the picture was still up. There we go. Sorry about that. Atal, seated up on ivory dies in the festooned shrine at the top of the temple, was fully 3 centuries old, but still very keen of mind and memory. From him, Carter learned many things about the gods, and mainly that they were indeed only Earth's gods, ruling feebly on our own dreamland and having no power or habitation elsewhere. They might, Atal said, heed a man's prayer if in good humor. But one must not think of climbing to their onyx stronghold atop Kadath in the cold waste. It was lucky that no man knew where Kadath towers, for the fruits of ascending it would be very grave. Atal's companion, Barzai the Wise, had been drawn screaming into the sky for climbing merely the known peak of Hatheg Kla. With unknown Kadath, if ever found, matters would be much worse, for although Earth's gods may sometimes be surpassed by a wise mortal, they are protected by the other gods from outside, whom is better not to discuss. At least twice in the world's history, the other gods set their seal upon Earth's primal granite, once in antediluvian times, as guessed from a drawing in the parts of the Panotic manuscripts, too ancient to be read, and once on Hatheg Kla, when Barzai the Wise tried to see the Earth's gods dancing in the moonlight. So, Atal said, it would be much better to let the gods alone except for tactful prayers. Carter, Though disappointed by Attal's discouraging advice and by the meager help to be found in the Panotic manuscripts and of the 7 cryptical books of Hassan, did not wholly despair. First, he questioned the old priest about the marvelous sunset city seen from the railed terrace, thinking that perhaps he might find it without the god's aid. But Attal could tell him nothing. Probably, Attal said, the place belonged to a special dream world, and not that to the general land of vision that many know. And conceivably, it might be on another planet. In the case of Earth's gods, could not guide him as if they would. But this was not likely, since the stopping of the dream shewed pretty clearly that it was something the Great Ones wished to hide from him. Then Carter did a wicked thing, offering his guileless host so many draughts of the moon wine which the Zoogs had given him that the old man had become irresponsibly talkative. Robbed of his reserve, poor Attal babbed freely of forbidden things, telling of the great image reported by travelers as carved on the solid rock of the mountain Negronk, on the Isle of Oreb, in the southern sea, and hinting that it may be the likeness of which Earth's gods once wrought their own features in the days when they danced in the moonlight on that mountain. And he hiccuped likewise that the features of that image were very strange, so that one might easily recognize them, and that they were sure signs of the authentic race of the gods. Now the use of all this in finding the gods became once apparent to Carter. It is known that in disguise the younger among the great ones often espouse the daughters of the men, so that around the borders of the cold waste, wherein stands Kadath, the peasants must all hear their blood. This being so, the way to find the waste must be to see the stone face of Negronic, and find the mark on the features. Then, having noted them with care, to search for such features among living men. Where they are plainest and thickest, there must be gods that dwell nearest, and whatever stony waste lies beyond the backs of the village, in that place must be wherein stands Kadath. Much of the great ones might have learnt in other regions, and those with their blood might inherit little memories very useful to a seeker. They might not know their parentage, for the gods so dislike to be known amongst men that none can be found or who see their faces wittingly, a thing which Carter realized even as he had sought to scale the Kadath. But they would have queer, lofty thoughts misunderstood by their fellows. It would sing so far places and gardens so unlike any known even in the dreamland that common folk would often call them fools, and from all the one could perhaps learn the old secrets of Kadath, or gain hints of the marvelous sunset city which gods held secret. And more, one might in certain cases see some well-loved child of a god as hostage, or even capture some young god himself, disguised and dwelling amongst men, with a comely peasant maiden as his bride. Sorry, I need water. Attal, however, did not know how to find Negronic on its Isle of Oreb, and recommended that Carter follow the singing sky under its bridges down to the southern sea, where no Burgess of Ulthar has ever been, but whence the merchants come in boats or long caravans of mules and two-wheeled carts. There is a great city there, Dilath-Leen, but in Ulthar, its reputation had become that of the black three-banked galleys that sail to it with rubies from no clearly named shore. The traders that come from these galleys deal with the jewelers are human, or nearly so, but the rowers are never beheld, and it is not thought wholesome in Ulthar that merchants should trade with black ships from unknown places whose rowers cannot be exhibited. By the time that he had given this information, Atal was very drowsy, and Carter laid him gently on the couch of inlaid ebony and gathered his long beard decorously on his chest. As he turned to go, he observed that no suppressed fluttering followed him, and wondered why the Zoogs had become so lax in their curious pursuit. Then he noticed all the sweet, complacent cats of Ulthar licking their chops with unusual gusto, and recalled the spitting and caterwauling he had faintly heard in the lower parts of the temple while absorbed in the old priest's conversation. He recalled, too, the evilly hungry way in which an especially impudent young Zoog had regarded a small black cat in the cobbled street outside, and because he loved nothing on earth more than small black cats, he stooped and pet the sweet cat of Ulthar as they licked their chops. It did not mourn because of those inquisitive Zoogs would escort him no farther. It was sunset now, so Carter stopped to an ancient inn on a steep little street overlooking a lower town, and as he went out onto the balcony of his room, gazed out at the sea of red-tiled roofs and cobbled ways in the pleasant fields beyond, all mellow and magical in slanted light. He swore that Ulthar would be very likely a place to dwell in always, were not the memory of greater Sunset City ever goading one toward unknown perils. Then twilight fell, and the pink walls of the plastered gables turned violet and mystic, and little yellow lights floated up one by one from lattice windows, and sweet bells pealed in the temple of the temple tower above, and the first star winked softly above the meadows across the sky. With the night came song, and Carter nodded as the lutenist praised ancient days from beyond the filigreed balconies and tessellated courts of simple Ulthar. And there might be even sweetness even in the voices of Ulthar's many cats, but that they were mostly heavy and silent from strange feasting. Some of them stole off to the cryptical realms which are known only to cats, and which villagers say are on Moon's dark sides. Whether the cats leaped from tall housetops, but one small black cat crept upstairs and sprang onto Carter's lap to purr and play, and curled up near his feet when he lay down at last on the little couch whose pillows were stuffed with fragrant, drowsy herbs. In the morning, Carter joined a caravan of merchants bound for Dilath Leen with the spun wool of Ulthar and the cabbages of Ulthar's busy farms. And for 6 days they rode with tinkling bells on the smooth road beside the sky, stopping some nights at the ends with the little quaint fishing towns, and on other nights camping under the stars while snatches of boatmen's songs came from the placid river. The country was very beautiful, with green hedges and groves and picturesque peaked cottages with octagonal windmills. On the 7th day, a blur of smoke arose on the horizon ahead, and then tall black towers of Dilath Leen, which, built mostly of basalt. Dilath Leen, with its thin, angular towers, looks in the distance like a bit of Giant's Causeway, and its streets are dark and uninviting. There are many dismal sea taverns near the myriad wharves, and all the town is thronged with the strange people from the sea. I'm not going to say the word, you people will say something. I'm not going to say it. Of every land on earth, of which a few are said to not be of the earth. Carter questioned the oddly robed men of that city in the peak of Negronic on the Isle of Oreb, and found that they knew of it well. Ships came from Barhana on that island, and on being due to the thither of in only a month. And Negronic is only 2 days zebra ride from that port. Sorry, I lost my voice. But few had seen the stone face of the god, because it is on a very difficult side of Negronic, whose overlooks only sheer crags in a valley of sinister lava. Once the gods were angered with men on that side, and spoke of the matter to the other sea gods. It was hard to get this information from the traders and sailors in Daiwathwain's sea taverns, because they mostly preferred to whisper of the black galleys. One of them was due in a week with rubies from unknown shore, and the townsfolk dreaded to see its dock. The mouths of the men who came from it to trade were too wide, and their turbans were humped in 2 points above their foreheads, was in especially bad taste, and their shoes were the shortest and queerest ever seen in the 6 kingdoms. But worst of all was the matter of the unseen rowers. These 3 banks of oars moved too briskly and too accurately and vigorously to be comfortable, and it was not right for a ship to stay in port for weeks while the merchants traded, and yet no glimpse of the crew was seen. It was not fair to the tavern keepers of Daiwathwain, or to the grocers and butchers either, for not a scrap of provisions was ever seen aboard. The merchants took only gold and stout slaves from Parg across the river. That was all they ever took, those unpleasantly featured merchants and their unseen rowers. Never anything from the butchers and grocers, but only gold and fat men of Parg, whom they bought by the pound. And the odors from the galleys which the south wind blew in from the wharves to not be described. Only by constantly smoking strong thagweed could even the hardiest denizen of the old sea taverns bear them. Daiwathwain would never have been tolerated by the black galleys such as the rubies, had the rubies been obtainable elsewhere. But no mine in all Earth's dreamland was ever known to produce their like. Of these things, Daiwathwain cosmopolitan folk chiefly gossiped, while Carter waited patiently for the ships from Barhana, which might bear them to the isle, whereas carven Negronic towers, lofty and barren. Meanwhile, he did not fail to seek through the haunts of far travelers for any tales they might have concerning Kadath in the cold waste of the marvelous city of marble walls and silver fountains seen below terraces in the sunset. Of these things, however, he learned nothing, though he once thought that a certain old slant-eyed merchant looked queerly intelligent when the cold waste was spoken of. The man was reputed to trade with the horrible stone villages on the icy desert plateau of Lang, which no healthy folk visit, and whose evil fires are seen at night from afar. He was even rumored to have dealt with that high priest not to be described, who wears a yellow silken mask over his face, and dwells all alone in the prehistoric stone masonry. That such a person might well have had a nibbling traffic with such beings as may conceivably dwell in the cold waste was not to be doubted. But Carter soon found that it was no use questioning him. Then The black galley slipped into the harbor past the basalt mole of the tall lighthouse, silent and alien, and with a strange stench that south wind drove into the town. Uneasiness rustled through the taverns along that waterfront, and after a while the dark, wide-mouthed merchants with wide-humped turbans and short feet clumped stealthily ashore to seek the bazaars of the jewelers. Carter observed them closely and disliked them for how longer he looked at them. Then he saw them drive the stout men of Parg up the gangplank, grunting and sweating into the singular galley, and wondered in what lands, or if in any lands at all, these fat people might be destined to serve. Sorry, it's getting very hot in here. I'm gonna turn a fan on really quick. Thank you for being patient. Okay. And on the third evening of that galley's stay, one of the uncomfortable merchants spoke to him, smirking sinfully and hinting at what he had heard in the taverns of Carter's quest. He appeared to have knowledge too secret for public telling, and although the sound of his voice was unbearably hateful, Carter felt that the lure of so far a traveler must not be overlooked. He bade him, therefore, to be his guest in locked chambers above, and drew out the last of the Zoog's moon wine to loosen his tongue. The strange merchant drank heavily, but smirked unchanged by the draught. Then he drew forth a curious bottle with wine of his own, and Carter saw that the bottle was a single hollowed ruby, grotesquely carved in patterns too fabulous to be comprehended. He offered his own wine to his host, and though Carter took only at least a sip, he felt the dizziness of space and the fever of unimagined jungles. All the while, the guest had been smiling more and more broadly, and as Carter slipped into the blankness, the last thing he saw was the dark, odious face convulsed with evil laughter. Something quite unspeakable, where one of the two frontal puffs of an orange turban had become disarranged with the shakings of the epileptic mirth. Sorry, give me just a moment. Carter next had consciousness amidst the horrible odors beneath the tent-like awning on the deck of his ship. With the marvelous coasts of the southern sea flying in an unnatural swiftness, he was not chained, but three of the dark, sardonic merchants stood grinning nearby. and the sight of those humps in their turbans made them almost as faint as did the stench that filtered up through the sinister hatches. He saw slip past them the glorious lands and cities of which a fellow dreamer of earth, a lighthouse keeper in ancient Kingsport, had often discoursed in the old days, and recognized the templed terraces of Zat, abode of forgotten dreams, the spires of an infamous Thalarian, that demon city of 1,000 wonders, where the Eidolon Wathi reigns, the charnel gardens of Shura, land of pleasures unattained, and the twin headlands of crystal, meeting above in resplendent arch, which guard the harbor. Sona Neil, bless the land of fancy. Past all these lands, the malodorous ship flew unwholesomely, signed by the abnormal strokes of those unseen rowers below. And before the day was done, Carter saw that the steersman could have no other goal than the basalt pillars of the west, beyond which simple folk say splendid Cathuria lies, but which wise dreamers well know are the gates of monstrous cataract, wherein the oceans of earth dreamland dropped wholly from to abysmal nothingness and shoot through the empty spaces toward other worlds and other stars in the awful voids outside the ordered universe, where the demon Sultan Azathoth gnaws hungrily in chaos amid pounding and piping in the hellish dancing of the other gods, blind, voiceless, tenebrous, and mindless, with their soul and messenger Nyarlathotep. Meanwhile, the three sardonic merchants would give no word of their intent, though Carter well knew they must be leagued with those who wished to hold him from his quest. It is understood in the land of dream that the other gods had many agents moving amongst the men, and all of these agents, whether wholly human or slightly less than human, were eager to work with the will of the blind, mindless beings in return for the favor of the hideous soul and messenger, the crawling chaos, Nyarlathotep. So Carter inferred that the merchants of the humped turbans, hearing of his daring search for the great ones in their castle on Kadath, had decided to take him away and deliver him to Nyarlathotep for whatever nameless bounty might be offered for such a prize. What might be the land of those merchants in our known universe or in eldritch spaces outside, Carter could not guess, nor could he imagine what hellish trysting place they would meet the crawling chaos to give him up and claim their reward. He knew, however, that no beings as nearly human as these would dare approach the ultimate knighted throne of the demon Azathoth in the formless central void. At the set of the sun, the merchants licked their excessively wide lips and glared hungrily, and one of them went below and returned from some hidden and offensive cabin with a pot and basket of plates. Then they squatted closer together beneath the awning and ate the smoking meat that was passed around. But when they gave Carter a portion, he found something very terrible in the size and shape of it. So he turned even paler than before and cast that portion into the sea when no eye was on him. And again he thought of those unseen rowers beneath, and of the suspicious nourishment from which their far too mechanical strength was derived. It was dark when the galley passed the basalt pillars of the west, and the sound of the ultimate cataract swelled portentous from ahead, and the spray of that cataract rose to obscure the stars, and the deck grew damp, and the vessel reeled in the surging current of the brink. Then, with a queer whistle and plunge, the leap was taken, and Carter felt the terrors of nightmare as earth fell away, and the great boat shot silent and comet-like into the planetary space. Never before had he known what shapeless black things lurk, and caper and flounder all through the ether, leering and grinning at such voyagers as they may pass, and sometimes feeling about with slimy paws when some moving object excites their curiosity. These are the nameless larvae of the other gods, and like them are blind and without mind, and possessed of singular hungers and thirsts. But that offensive galley did not aim as far as Carter had feared, for he soon saw the helmsman was steering a course directly for the moon. The moon was a crescent, shining larger and larger as they approached it, and chewing its singular craters and peaks uncomfortably. The ship made for the edge, and it soon became clear that its destination was that secret and mysterious side which had always been turned away from the earth, and which no fully human person, save perhaps the dreamer, Seneerth Ko, was ever to behold. The close aspect of the moon, as galley drew near, proved very disturbing to Carter, and he did not like the size and shape of the ruins which crumbled here and there. The dead temples on mountains were so placed that they could have glorified no wholesome or suitable gods. In the symmetries of broken columns, there seemed to lurk some dark and inner meaning which did not invite solution. And what the structure and proportions of the olden worshippers could have been, Carter steadily refused to conjecture. I'm sorry if you can hear the cicadas right now. The cicadas are very loud here. And I also have the window open to help with the draftiness of the room, so I don't sound like I have my nose plugged. When the ship rounded the edge and sailed over those lands unseen by man, there appeared in the queer landscape certain signs of life, and Carter saw how many low, broad, round cottages in the fields of grotesque whitish fungi. He noticed that these cottages had no windows, and thought that their shape suggested the huts of Esquimaux. It's a weird word. Then he glimpsed the oily waves of the sluggish sea, and knew that the voyage was once more to be by water, or at least through some liquid. The galley struck the surface with a peculiar sound, in the odd, elastic way the waves received. It was very perplexing to Carter. They now slid along at a great speed, once seeing nothing but the curious sea and a sky that was black and star-strewn, even though the sun shone scorchingly in it. There presently rose ahead the jagged hills of a leprous-looking coast, and Carter saw the thick, unpleasant gray towers of a city. The way they leaned and bent, the manner in which they were clustered, and the fact that they had no windows at all, was very disturbing to the prisoner. and he bitterly mourned the folly which had made him sip the curious wine of the merchant with a humped turban. As the coast drew nearer, and the hideous stench of that city grew stronger, he saw upon the jagged hills many forests, some whose trees he recognized as akin to that of the solitary moon tree in the enchanted wood of earth, from whose sap the small brown zoogs ferment their peculiar wine. Carter could now distinguish moving figures on the noisome wharves ahead, and the better he saw them, the worse he began to fear and detest them, for they were not men at all, or even approximately men, but great, grayish, white, slippery things, which could expand and contract at will, and whose principal shape, though it often changed, was that of a sort of toad without any eyes, but with a curiously vibrating mass of short pink tentacles on the end of its blunt, vague snout. These objects were waddling busily down the wharves, moving bales and crates and boxes with preternatural strength, and now and then hopping on or off some anchor galley with long oars in their forepaws. And now and then one would appear driving a herd of clumping slaves, which were indeed more approximate human beings, with wide mouths like the merchants who traded with dilethylene. Only these herds, being without turbans or shoes or clothing, did not seem very human after all. Some of these slaves, the fatter ones, whom a sort of overseer would pinch experimentally, were unloaded from ships and nailed in crates, which workers pushed into low warehouses or loaded them onto great lumbering vans. Once a van was hitched up and driven off, and the fabulous thing which drew it was such that Carter gasped, even after having seen the other monstrosities of that hateful place. Now and then, a small herd of slaves, dressed and turbaned like the dark merchants, would be driven aboard a galley, followed by a great crew of the slippery gray toad things as officers, navigators, and rowers. And Carter saw that the almost human creatures were reserved for the more ignominious kinds of servitude, which required no strength, such as steering and cooking, fetching and carrying, and bargaining with men on the earth or other planets where they had traded. These slaves must have been convenient on earth, for they were not truly unlike men who dressed and carefully shod and turbaned and could haggle in the shops of men without embarrassment or curious explanations. But most of them, unless lean and ill-favored, were unclothed and packed in crates and drawn off in lumbering lorries by fabulous things. Occasionally, other beings were unloaded and crated, some very like the semi-humans, some not so similar, and some not similar at all. And he wondered if any of the poor stout men of Parg were left to be unloaded and crated and shipped inland from the obnoxious strays. When the galley landed at a greasy-looking quay of spongy rock, and a nightmare horde of toad things wiggled out of the hatches, and two of them seized Carter and dragged him ashore. The smell and aspect of that city are beyond telling, and Carter held only scattered images of the tiled streets and black doorways, and endless precipices of gray vertical walls without windows. At length, he was dragged within a low doorway and made to climb infinite steps in pitch blackness. It was apparently all one to the toad things, whether it were light or dark. The odor of the place was intolerable, and when Carter was locked into a chamber and left alone, he scarcely had the strength to crawl around and ascertain its form and dimensions. It was circular and about 20 feet across. From then on, time ceased to exist. At intervals, food was pushed in, but Carter would not touch it. What his fate would be, he did not know, but he felt he had held for the coming of the frightful soul and messenger of infinity's other gods, the crawling chaos, Nyarlathotep. Finally, after an unguessed span of hours or days, the great stone door swung wide again, and Carter was shoved down the stairs and out the red-lit streets of that fearsome city. It was night on the moon, and although the town were stationed all through the town were stationed slaves bearing torches. In a detestable square, a sort of procession was formed. 10 of the toad things and 24 torch bearers, 11 on either side, and 1 each behind. Carter was placed in the middle of the line, 5 toad things ahead, and 5 behind, and 1 torchbearer on each side of him. Certain of the toad things produced disgustingly carven flutes of ivory and made loathsome sounds. To that hellish piping, the column advanced out on the tiled streets and into nighted plains of obscene fungi. Soon commencing to climb was one lower and more gradual hills that lay beyond the city. That on some frightful slope or blasphemous plateau the crawling chaos waited, Carter could not doubt, and he wished that the suspense might soon be over. The whining of the impious flutes was shocking, and he could have given worlds for some even half normal sound. But these toad things had no voices, and the slaves did not talk. Then, through that star-specked darkness, there did come a normal sound. It rolled from the higher hills, and from all the jagged peaks around it. It was caught up and echoed in a swelling pandemoniac chorus. It was the midnight yell of the cat, and Carter knew at last that the old village folk were right when they made low guesses about the cryptical realms which are only known to cats, and to which elders among cats repair by stealth nocturnally, springing from high housetops. Verily, it is to the moon's dark side that they go to leap and gambol on the hills and converse with ancient shadows. And here amidst the column of fetid things, Carter heard their homely, friendly cries, and thought of the steep roofs and warm hearths of the little lighted windows of home. Now, much of the speech of cats was known to Randolph Carter, and in far terrible place he uttered the cry that was suitable. But that he had need have not done, for even as his lips opened, he heard the chorus wax and drew nearer, and saw the swift shadows against the stars as small, graceful shapes leaped from hill to hill in the gathering regions. The call of the clan had been given, and before the foul procession had time even to frighten a cloud of smothering fur and phalanx of murderous claws were tidily and tempestuously upon it. The flute stopped, and there were shrieks in the night. Dying slaves screamed, and the cats spit and yowled and roared, but the toad things made never a sound as their stinking green ichor oozed fatally upon that porous earth with the obscene fungi. It was a stupendous sight while the torches lasted, and Carter had never before seen so many cats, black, gray, and white, yellow, tiger, and mixed and common, Persian and Manx, Tibetan, Angora, and Egyptian. All were there in the fury of battle, and there hovered over some trace of that profound and inviolate sanctity which made their goddess great in the temples of Bubastis. They would weep 7 strong at the throat of any slave, or the pink tentacled snout of the toad thing, and drag it down savagely onto the fungus plain, where myriads of their fellows would surge over it and into it with the frenzied claws and teeth of divine battle fury. Carter had seized a torch from a stricken slave, but was soon overborne by the surging waves of his loyal defenders. Then he lay in the utter blackness, hearing the clangor of war and the shouts of the victors, and feeling the soft paws of his friends as it rushed to and fro from the fray. At last, the awe and exhaustion closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, it was upon a strange scene. The great shining disk of the earth, 13 times greater than that of the moon, as we see it, had risen with floods of weird light over the lunar landscape. And across all those things of the wild plateau and ragged crest, there squatted one endless sea of cats in orderly array. Circle on circle they reached, and 2 of the 3 leaders out of the ranks were licking his face and purring to him consolingly. Of the dead slaves and toad things, there were not many signs, but Carter thought he saw one bone a little way off in the open space between him and the beginning of the solid circles of the warriors. Carter now spoke with the leaders in the soft language of cats, and he learned that his ancient friendship with the species was well known and often spoken of in the places where cats congregate. He had not been unmarked in Ulthar when he passed through, and the sleek old cats remembered how he petted them after they had attended to the hungry Zoogs who looked evilly at the small black cat. And they recalled too how he had welcomed the very little cat who came to him in the inn, and how he had given it a saucer of rich cream in the morning before he had left. The grandfather of that very little cat was the leader of the army now assembled, for he had seen the evil procession from a far hill and recognized the prisoner as a sworn friend of the kind of his earth and in the land of the dream. A yowl now came from a farther peak, and the old leader paused abruptly in conversation. It was one of the army's outposts, stationed on the highest of the mountains, to watch the one foe which Earth's cats fear, the very large and peculiar cats from Saturn, who, for some reason, have not been oblivious of the charm of our moon's dark side. They are leagued by treaty with the evil toad things, and are notoriously hostile to our earthly cats. So, at this juncture, a meeting would have been somewhat of a grave matter. After a brief consultation of generals, the cats arose and assumed a closer formation, crowding protectingly around Carter and preparing to take the great leap through space back to the housetops of our Earth in the dreamland. The old field marshal advised Carter to let himself be borne along smoothly and passively in the massed ranks of the furry leapers, and told him how to spring when the rest sprang and landed gracefully when the rest landed. He also offered to deposit him in any spot that he had desired, and Carter decided on the city of Dilathleen, whence the black galley had set out. For he had wished to sail thence to Oreb and the carven crest of Nagarik, and also to warn the people of the city who have no more traffic with black galleys, and indeed, that traffic could tactfully and judiciously broken off. Then, upon a signal, the cats all leapt gracefully, with their friend packed securely in their midst, while in a black cave on a far unhallowed summit of the Moon Mountains still vainly waited the crawling chaos Nyarlathotep. The leap of the cats through space was very swift, and being surrounded by his companions, Carter did not see this time the great black shapelessness that lurk and caper and flounder in the abyss. Before he had fully realized what had happened when he was back in the familiar room at the inn in Dilathleen, and the stealthy, friendly cats were pouring out of the window in streams. The old leader from Ulthar was the last to leave, and as Carter shook his paw, he said he would be able to go home by chicken crow. When dawn came, Carter went downstairs and learned that a week had elapsed since his capture and leaving. There was still nearly a fortnight to wait for the ship bound toward Oreb, and during that time he said what he could against the black galleys and their infamous ways. Most of the townfolk believed him, yet so found were the jewelers of great rubies that none would wholly promise to cease trafficking with the wide-mouthed merchants. If aught of evil ever befalls Dilathleen through such traffic, it would not be his fault. In about a week, the desiderate ship put on by the Black Mole and tall lighthouse, and Carter was glad to see she was a baroque of wholesome men, with painted sides and yellow lateen sails and a gray captain in silken robes. Her cargo was the fragrant resin of Oreb's inner groves and the delicate pottery baked by Negronic's ancient lava. For this were paid in the wool of Ulthar, in the iridescent textiles of Hatheg, in the ivory that the men carve across the river in Parg. Carter made arrangement with the captain to go to Baharna, and was told that the voyage would take him 10 days. And during the week of waiting, he talked much with the captain of the Garnish, and was told that very few had seen the carven face thereon, but the most travelers are content to learn that the legends from old people and lava gatherers and image makers of Baharna, and afterward say in their far homes that they indeed beheld it. The captain was not even sure that any person now living had beheld the carven face, for the wrong side of Nagarnik is very difficult and barren and sinister, and there are rumors of caves near the peak wherein dwell the night gaunts. But the captain did not wish to say just what the night gaunt might look like, since such cattle are known to haunt most persistently in the dreams of those who think too much of them. Then Carter asked that captain about the unknown Kadath in the cold waste, in the marvelous sunset city, but of these the good man could truly tell nothing. Carter sailed out of Dilathween one early morning, when the tide turned, and saw the first rays on the sunrise on the thin angular towers of that dismal basalt town. And for 2 days they sailed eastward into the green coasts, and saw often the pleasant fishing towns that climbed up steeply with their red roofs and chimney pots from old dreaming wharves and beaches where nests lay drying. But on the 3rd day they turned sharply south, where the roll of water was stronger, and soon passed from sight of land. On the 5th day the sailors were nervous, but the captain apologized for their fears, saying the ship was about to pass over the weedy walls and broken columns of a sunken city too old for memory, and that when the water was clear, one could see so many moving shadows in the deep place that the simple folk disliked it. He admitted, moreover, that many ships had been lost in this part of the sea, having been hailed when quite close to it, but never seen again. That night the moon was very bright, and one could see a great way down the water. There was so little wind that the ship could not move much, and the ocean was very calm. Looking over the rail, Carter saw many fathoms deep the dome of a great temple, and in front of it an avenue of unnatural sphinxes, leading to what once seemed like a public square. Dolphins sported merrily in and out of the ruins, and porpoises reveled clumsily here and there, sometimes coming to the surface and leaping clear out of the sea. As the ship drifted on a little, the floor of the ocean rose in the hills, and in one could clearly mark the lines of an ancient climbing streets and washed down walls of myriad of little houses. Then the suburbs appeared, and finally a great lone building on the hill, of a simpler architecture and of that of other structures, and in a much better repair. It was dark and low and covered in 4 sides of a square, with a tower at each corner, a paved court in the center, and small, curious round windows all over it. Probably it was of basalt, though weeds draped over a greater part, and such it was lonely and impressive place on that far hill that it may have been a temple or monastery. Some phosphorescent fish inside it gave the small round windows an aspect of shining, and Carter did not blame the sailors much for their fears. Then, by the watery moonlight, he noticed an odd high monolith in the middle of that central court, and saw that something was tied to it. And when, after getting a telescope from the captain's cabin, he saw that bound thing was a sailor in the silk robes of Oreib, head downward and without any eyes, he was glad that a rising breeze soon took the ship ahead to more healthy parts of the sea. The next day, they spoke with a ship with violet sails bound for Zar, in the land of forgotten dreams, with bulbs of strange colored lilies for cargo. And on the evening of the 11th day, they came in sight of the Isle of Oreib, with Negronic rising jagged and snow-crowned in the distance. Oreib is a very great isle, and its port of Baharna a mighty city. The wharves of Baharna are porphyry, and the city rises in great stone terraces behind them, having the streets of steps that are frequently arched by buildings and bridges between buildings. There is a great canal which goes under the whole city, in a tunnel with granite gates and leads to the inland lake of Yath, whose farther shore are the vast clay brick ruins of a primal city whose name is not remembered. As the ship grew into the harbor at evening, the twin beacons, Dawn and Thal, gleamed a welcome, and in all the million windows of Baharna's terraces, mellow lights peeped out quietly and gradually as the stars peep out overhead in the dusk, till that steep and climbing seaport became a glittering constellation hung between the stars of heaven and the reflections those stars in the still harbor. The captain, after landing, made Carter a guest in his own small house on the shore of Yath, where the rear of the town slopes down to it, and his wife and servants brought strange, toothsome foods for the traveler's delight. And in the days after that, Carter asked for rumors and legends from Negronic in all the taverns and public spaces where lava gatherers and image makers meet, but could not find one who had been up to the higher slopes or had seen the carven face. Negronic was a hard mountain with only an accursed valley behind it, and besides, one could never depend on the certainty that night gaunts are altogether fabulous. When the captain sailed back to Dilathleen, Carter took quarters in an ancient tavern opening up to the alley of steps in the original part of town, which is built of brick and resembles the ruins of Yath's farther shore. Here he had laid his plans for the ascent of Negronic and correlated all that he had learned from the lava gatherers about the roads thither. The keeper of the tavern was a very old man, and had heard many legends that he was a great help. He even took Carter to an upper room in the ancient house and shewed him a crude picture, which the traveler had scratched on the clay in the olden days when men were bolder and less reluctant to visit Negronic's higher slopes. The old tavern keeper's great-grandfather had heard from his great-grandfather that the traveler who searched that picture and climbed Negronic and had seen the carven face, here drawing it for others to behold. But Carter had very great doubts, since the large rough features on the wall were hasty and careless, and wholly overshadowed by a crowd of little companion shapes in the worst possible taste, with horns and wings and claws and curling tails. At last, having gained all the information he was likely to gain in the taverns and public places of Baharna, Carter hired a zebra and set out one morning on the road of Yath's shore for those inland parts wherein towers stony Negronic. On his right were rolling hills and pleasant orchards and neat little stone farmhouses, and he was much reminded of the fertile fields that flanked the sky. By evening, he was near the nameless ancient ruins of Yath's farther shore, and though old lava gatherers had warned him not to camp out there at night, he tethered his zebra to a curious pillar before a crumbling wall and laid his blanket in a sheltered corner beneath some carvings whose meaning none could decipher. Around him he had wrapped another blanket, for the nights are cold in Oriab, and when, upon awakening, once he thought he felt the wings of some insect brushing his face, he covered his head altogether and slept in peace until aroused by macaw birds in distant resin groves. The sun had just come up over the great slope whereon leagues of primal brick foundation and worn walls and occasional cracked pillars and pedestals stretched out so desolate to the shore of Yath. And Carter looked about for his tethered zebra. Great was his dismay to see the docile beast stretched prostrate beside the curious pillar to which he had been tied. And still greater was the vex on finding the steed that was quite dead, with his blood sucked away through a singular wound on his throat. His pack had been disturbed, and shiny knickknacks taken away. And all around the dusty soil were great webbed footprints for which he could not in any way account. The legends and warnings of lava gatherers occurred to him, and he thought of what had brushed his face in the night. Then he shouldered his pack and strode toward Negronic, though not without a shiver when he saw close to him, as the highway passed through the ruins of a great gaping low arch in the wall of the old temple, with steps leading down into the darkness farther than he could peer. His course now led uphill through wilder and partly wooded country, and he saw only the huts of charcoal burners and the camps of those who gathered resin in the groves. The whole air was fragrant from balsam, and the maga birds sang blithely as they flashed their 7 colors in the sun. Near sunset, he came on a new camp of lava gatherers, returning with laden sacks from Negronic's lower slopes. And here he also camped, listening to the songs and tales of these men, and overhearing what they whispered about a companion that they had lost. He had climbed high to reach a mass of fine lava above him, and the nightfall did not return to his fellows. When they looked for him the next day, they found only his turban, nor was there any sign on the crags below that he had fallen. They did not search any more, because the old men among them said to be of no use. No one ever found what the night gaunts took, though those beasts themselves were so uncertain as to be almost fabulous. Carter asked them if night gaunts sucked blood and liked shiny things and left webbed footprints, but they all shook their heads negatively and seemed frightened at making such an inquiry. When he saw how taciturn they had become when he asked them, no more, but he went to sleep in his blanket. The next day, he rose with the lava gatherers and exchanged farewells before he rode west and rode east on a zebra he had bought from them. The older men gave him blessings and warnings and told that he had better not climb too high on Negronic, but while he thanked them heartily, he was in no way dissuaded. For still he did feel that he must find the gods on unknown Kadath, and win from them a way to that haunting and marvelous city in the sunset. By noon, after a long uphill ride, he came upon some abandoned brick villages of the hill people who had once dwelt thus close to Negronic, and carved images from its smooth lava. Here they had dwelt till the days of old tavern keeper's grandfather, but about the time that they had felt their presence was disliked. Their homes had crept even up the mountain slope, and the higher they built, the more people they would miss when the sun rose. At last, they decided it would be better to leave altogether, since things were somehow so in the end. All of them went down to the sea and dwelt in Baharna, inhabiting a very old quarter and teaching their sons in the art of image making, which to this day they carry on. It was from these children, the exiled hill people, that Carter had heard the best tales about Negronic when searching through Baharna's ancient taverns. All this time, the great gaunt side of Negronic was looming up higher and higher as Carter approached it. There were sparse trees on the lower slope, and feeble shrubs above them, and then the bare, hideous rock rose spectral into the sky to mix with frost and ice and eternal snow. Carter could see the rifts and the raggedness of the somber stone, and did not welcome the prospect of climbing it. In places there were solid streams of lava. The ceramic heaps that littered the slopes and ledges, 90 eons ago, before even the gods danced upon its pointed peak, that mountain had spoken with fire and roared with the voices of inner thunders. Now it towered all silent and sinister, bearing on the hidden side of that secret Titan image, whereof rumor told, and there were caves in that mountain, which might be empty and alone, with elder darkness, or might, if legend spoke true, hold horrors of form not yet be surmised. The ground sloped upward to the foot of Negronic, thinly covered with scrub oaks and ash trees, and strewn with bits of rock and lava and ancient cinder. There were many charred embers of many camps where the lava gatherers were wont to stop, and many rude altars which they had built either to appropriate the great old ones, or to ward off any that dreamed of Negronic's high passes or labyrinthine caves. At evening, Carter reached the farthermost pile of embers and camped for the night, tethering his zebra to a sapling and wrapping himself well in a blanket before going to sleep. And all through the night, a Vunith howled distantly in the shore of a hidden pool. But Carter felt no fear of that amphibious terror, since he had been told with certainty that not one of them dares even approach the slopes of Negronic. In the clear sunshine of morning, Carter had begun the long ascent, taking his zebra as far as that useful beast could go, but tying it to a stunted ash tree where when the floor of the thin road became too steep. Thereafter, he scrambled up alone, first through the forest with its ruins of old villages and overgrown clearings, and then over the tough grass where anemic shrubs grew here and there. He regretted coming clear of the trees, since the slope was very precipitous and the whole thing rather dizzying. At length he began to discern the local countryside spread out beneath him whenever he looked around. The deserted huts of the image makers, the groves of resin trees, and the camps of those gathered from them, the woods where prismatic magaz nest and sing, and even a hint very far away from the shores of Yath, in those forbidding ancient ruins whose name is forgotten. He found it best not to look around, and kept on climbing, till the shrubs became very sparse, and there were often nothing but the tough grass to cling to. Then the soil became meager, and the great patches of bare rock cropping out, and now and then the nest of a condor in a crevice. Finally, there was nothing at all but bare rock, and had it not been very rough and weathered, he could scarcely have ascended farther. Knobs, ledges, and pinnacles, however, helped greatly, and it was cheering to see the occasional sign of some lava gatherer scratched clumsily on the friable stone, and know that a wholesome human creature had been there before him. After a certain height, the presence of man was further shewn by handholds and footholds hewn where they were needed, and by little quarries and excavations where some choice vein or stream of lava had been found. In one place, a narrow ledge had been chopped artificially to an especially rich deposit far to the right of the main line of ascent. Once or twice, Carter dared look around, and was almost stunned by the spread of landscape below. All the island betwixt him and the coast lay open around his sight, with Baharna's stone terraces and smoke of its chimneys mystical in the distance, and beyond the illimitable southern sea with its curious secrets. Thus far there had been much winding around the mountain, so that farther and carven sides were the hidden. Carter now saw a ledge running upward and to the left, which seemed to head the way he wished, and course he took in hope that he might prove continuous. After 10 minutes, he saw it was indeed no cul-de-sac, but it was led steeply in an arc, which would, unless suddenly interrupted or deflected, bring him, after a few hours climbing, to the unknown southern slope, overlooking the desolate crags in the accursed valley of lava. As new country came into view below him, he saw that it was bleaker and wilder than those seaward lands that he had traversed. The mountain side, too, was somewhat different, being here pierced by curious cracks and caves not found on the straighter route that he had left. Some of these were above him and some beneath him, all opening sheerly perpendicular cliffs and wholly unreachable by any feet of man. The air was very cold, and it was hard, was the climbing, and he did not mind it. Only the increasing rarity bothered him, and thought that perhaps it was which had turned the heads of other travelers and excited those absurd tales of night gaunts, whereby they explained the loss of such climbers as fell from perilous paths. He was not much impressed by travelers' tales, but had a good curved scimitar in case of the trouble. All lesser thoughts were lost in wish to see the carven face which might set him on the track of the gods atop unknown Kadath. At last, in the fearsome iciness of upper space, he came round fully to the hidden side of Negronic, and saw in infinite gulfs below him the lesser crags and sterile abysses of lava which marked the olden wrath of the great ones. There was unfolded, too, a vast expanse of country to the south, but it was a desert land without fair fields or cottage chimneys, and seemed to have no ending. No trace of the sea was visible on this side, for Oriab is a great island. Black caverns and odd crevices were still numerous on the sheer vertical cliffs, but none of them was accessible to a climber. There now loomed aloft a great beetling mass, which hampered the upward view, and Carter was for a moment shaken with doubt, lest it prove impassable. Poised in windy insecurity miles above Earth, with only space and death on one side of a slippery walls of rock on other. He knew for a moment the fear that masked men shunned Negronic's hidden side. He could not turn around, yet the sun was already low. If there was no other way aloft, the night would find him crouching there still, and the dawn would not find him at all. But there was a way, and he saw it in due season. Only a very expert dreamer could have used these imperceptible footholds, yet to Carter they were sufficient. Surmounting now the outward hanging rock, he found the slope above much easier than that below, since a great glacier's melting had left a generous space with loam and ledges. To the far left, a precipice dropped straight from unknown heights to unknown depths, with a cave's dark mouth just out of reach above him. Elsewhere, however, the mountain slanted back strongly, and even gave him a space to lean on and rest. He felt from the chill that this must be near the snow line, and looked up to see the glittering pinnacles which be shining in that of ruddy sunlight. Surely enough, there was the snow uncounted thousands of feet above, and below it was a great beetling crag, like he had seen just before he had climbed. Hanging there forever in holdout line, black against the white of the frozen peak. And when he saw that crag, he gasped and cried out loud, and clutched at the jagged rock in awe, for the titanic outcropping had not stayed as Earth's dawn had shaped it, but gleamed red and stupendous in the sunset that was carved and polished with features of a god. Stern and terrible shone that face, that though sunlit with a fire, how vast it was no mind could ever measure. But Carter knew at once that man could never have fashioned it. It was a god chiseled by the hands of other gods, and looked down hotly and majestic upon the seeker. Rumor had said it was a strange and not to be mistaken, and Carter saw that it was indeed so, for those long narrow eyes and long-lobed ears and thin nose and pointed chin all spoke of a race that is not of men but gods. And he clung overawed in the lofty and perilous eyrie, even though it was that which he had expected and come to find. For there is in a god's face more than marvel and prediction can tell. And when the face is vaster than the great temple, and seen looking down at the sunset and cryptic silences of the upper world, from whose dark lava it was divinely hewn of old, the marvel is so strong that none may escape it. Here too was added the marvel of recognition, for although he had planned to search all dreamland over those whose likeness to this face might mark them as the god's children, he now knew that he need not do so. Certainly the great face carven on that mountain was of no strange sort, but the kin of such as he had seen often in the taverns of the seaport of Cepheus, which lies on Uthnagarrai, beyond the Tenarian hills, and ruled over by King Kuranes, whom Carter once knew in waking life. every year, sailors with such a face came to dark ships from north to trade of their onyx for the carved jade and spun gold and little red singing birds of Cepheus, and it was clear that these could be no other than half-gods he sought. Where they dwelt, there must be a cold waste lie close, and within it, unknown Kadath and its onyx castle for the great ones. So to Cepheus he must go, far distant from the Isle of Oreb, and in the parts as he would take from Diathleen and of Sky to the bridge of Nir, and again to the enchanted wood of the Zoogs, whence lay and would bend northward through the garden lands of Orkanos and gilded spires of Thron, where he might find a galleon bound over the Ceranian Sea. But dusk was now thick, and the great carven face looked down even sterner in shadow. Perched on that ledge, night found the seeker, and in the blackness he might neither go down nor go up, but only stand and cling and shiver in that narrow place, till the day came, praying to keep awake and lest sleep loose his hold, and send him down the dizzy miles of air to the crags and sharp rocks of the accursed valley. The stars came out, but save for them there was only black nothingness in his eyes, nothingness weighted with death, against whose beckoning he must do no more than cling to the rocks and lean back away from an unseen brink. The last thing of earth that he saw was in the gloaming was a condor soaring close to the westward precipice beside him, and darting, screaming away when it came near the cave, whose mouth yawned just out of reach. Suddenly, without warning, sound in the dark, Carter felt his curved scimitar drawn stealthily out of his belt by some unseen hand. Then he heard it clatter down the rocks below. And between him and the Milky Way, he thought of a very terrible outline of something noxiously thin and horned and tailed and bat-winged. Other things, too, had begun to blot out patches of stars west of him, as a flock of vague entities were flapping thickly and silently out of that inaccessible cave in the face of the precipice. Then a sort of cold, rubbery arm seized his neck, and something else seized his feet, and he was lifted inconsiderably up, swung about in space. Another minute, and the stars were gone, and Carter knew that the night gaunts had got him. They bore him breathless into that cliffside cavern and through monstrous labyrinths beyond. When he struggled, as at first he did by instinct, they tickled him with deliberation. They made no sound at all themselves, and even their membranous wings were silent. They were frightfully cold and damp and slippery, and their paws needed one detestably. Soon they were plunging hideously downward through inconceivable abysses, in the whirling, giddying, sickening rush of dank tomb-like air, and Carter felt they were shooting into the ultimate vortex of shrieking and demonic madness. He screamed again and again, but whenever he did so, the black paws tickled him with greater subtlety. Then he saw a sort of gray phosphorescence about, and then he guessed they were coming even to that inner world of subterranean horror, of which dim legends tell, and which only litten by the pale death fire wherewith reeks the ghoulish airs and the primal mists of the pits at earth's core. At last, far below him, He saw faint grey lines of ominous pinnacles, which he knew to be the fabled peaks of Thok. Awful and sinister they stand in the haunted dusk of sunless and eternal depths, higher than man may reckon, and guarding terrible valleys where bulls crawl and burrow nastily. But Carter preferred to look at them than that of his captors, which were indeed shocking and uncouth beings with wide, smooth, oily, whale-like surfaces, unpleasant horns that curved inward toward each other, bat wings whose beatings made no sound, ugly, prehensile paws, and barbed tails that lashed needlessly and disquietingly. And worst of all, they never spoke or laughed, and never smiled, because they had no faces at all to smile with, only a suggestive blankness where a face ought to be. All they ever did was clutch and fly and tickle. That was the way of the night gaunts. As the band flew lower, the peaks of Thok rose gray, towering on all sides. Sorry, I'm smacking a bit because this Amaretto Sour is very, very sour. And towering on all sides, and one saw clearly that nothing lived on that austere and impassive granite of the endless twilight, and still lower levels of death fires and air gave out. And one met only the primal blackness of the void save, aloft with thin peaks stood out goblin-like. Soon the peaks were very far away, and nothing about but the great rushing winds with the dankness of nethermost grottos in them. Then, in the end, the night gaunts landed on a floor of unseen things which felt like layers of bones, and left Carter all alone in the black valley. To bring him thither was the duty of night gaunts that guard Negronic. And this done, they flapped away silently. When Carter tried to trace the flight, he found he could not, since even the peaks of Thok had faded out of sight. There was nothing anywhere but blackness and horror and silence and bones. Now Carter knew from a certain source that he was in the Vale of Pnath. That's Pnath, okay. Where crawl and burrow the enormous bulls, but he did not know what to expect, because no one had ever seen a bull, or even guessed what a thing might be like. Bulls are known only by dim rumor, from the rustling they make amongst the mountains of bones and the slimy touch they have when they wriggle past one. They cannot be seen because they creep only in the dark. Carter did not wish to meet a bull, so listened intently for any sound in the unknown depths of bones about him. Even of Pnath and its approaches were not unknown to one with whom he had talked of much in the old days. In brief, it seemed fairly likely that this was the spot into which all the ghouls of the waking world cast the refuse of their feastings, and that if he had but good luck, he might stumble upon a mighty crag taller even than that of Thok's peaks, which marks edge of their domain. Showers of bones would tell him where to look, and once he found he could call to a ghoul to let down a ladder, for strange to say, he had a very singular link with these terrible creatures. A man he had known in Boston, a painter of strange pictures, with a secret studio in an ancient and unhallowed alley near a graveyard, had actually made friends with the ghouls and had taught him to understand the simpler art of their disgusting meeping and glibbering. This man had vanished at last, and Carter was not sure, but he might find him now, and use, for the first time in dreamland, that faraway English was of dim, waking life. In any case, he felt he could persuade a ghoul to guide him out of Panath, and it would be better to meet a ghoul which one can see than a bull which one cannot see. So, Carter walked in the dark and ran when he thought he had heard something among the bones underfoot. Once he bumped into a stony slope, he knew it must be the base of one of Thok's peaks. Then, at last, he heard a monstrous rattling and clatter which reached far up into the air, and he became sure he had come nigh to the crag of the ghouls. He was not sure he could have heard this from the valley miles below, but realized that the inner world had very strange laws. As he pondered, he was struck by a flying bone so heavy that it must have been a skull, and therefore, realizing his nearness to the fateful crag, he sent up as best he might that a meeping cry, which is the call of the ghoul. Sound traveled slowly, so that it was some time before he heard the answering glibber. But it came at last, and before long he was told a rope ladder would be lowered. The wait for this was very tense, since there was no telling what might not have been stirred up among those bones by his shouting. Indeed, it was not long before he actually did hear vague rustling far off. As this thoughtfully approached, he became more and more uncomfortable, for he did not wish to move away from the spot where the ladder would become. Finally, the tension grew almost unbearable, and he was about to flee in panic before the thud of something on the newly heaped bones nearby drew his notice from the other sound. It was the ladder, and after a minute of groping, he had it taut to his hands. But the other sound did not cease, and followed him even as he climbed. He had not gone fully 5 feet above the ground when the rattling beneath waxed emphatic, and was a good 10 feet up when something swayed the ladder from below. At a height which must have been 15 or 20 feet, he felt his whole side brushed by a great slippery length which he alternatively convex and concave with wriggling, and thereafter he climbed desperately to escape the unendurable nuzzling of that loathsome and overfed bull whose form no man might see. For hours he climbed with aching arms and blistered hands, seeing again the grey death fire in Thok's uncomfortable pinnacles. At last he discerned above him the projecting edge of the great crag of the ghouls, whose vertical side he could not glimpse. And hours later he saw a curious face peering over as a gargoyle peers over the parapet of Notre Dame. This almost made him lose his hold through faintness, but a moment later he was himself again, for his vanished friend Richard Pickman had once introduced him to a ghoul, and he knew well their canine faces and slumping forms and unmentionable idiosyncrasies. So he had himself well under control when the hideous thing pulled him out of the dizzying emptiness under the edge of the crag, and did not scream at the partly consumed refuse. heaped on one side were the squatting circles of ghouls who nod and watch curiously. He was now on a dim-lit plain, whose sole topographical features were great boulders and the entrances of burrows. The ghouls were in general respectful, even if one did attempt to pinch him, while several others eyed his leanness speculatively. Through patient glibbering, he made inquiries regarding his vanished friend, and found he had become a ghoul of some prominence in abysses nearer the waking world. A greenish elderly ghoul offered to conduct him to Pickman's present habitation, so despite a natural loathing, he followed the creature into a capacious burrow and crawled after him for hours in the blackness of rank mold. They emerged on a dim plain strewn with singular relics of earth, old gravestones, broken urns, and grotesque fragments of monuments, and Carter realized with some emotion he was probably nearer the waking world than any other time he had gone down the 700 steps from the cavern of flame to the gate of deeper slumber. There, on the tombstone of 1768, stolen from the Granary burying ground in Boston, sat a ghoul which was once artist Richard Upton Pickman. It was naked and rubbery, and had acquired so much of the ghoulish physiognomy that its human origin was already obscure. But it was remembered a little English, and was able to converse with Carter in grunts and monosyllables, helped out now and then by the glibbering of ghouls. When it learned that Carter wished to get to the Enchanted Wood, and from there the city of Cepheus and Uth-Nargai, beyond the Tenarian hills, it seemed rather doubtful, for the ghouls of the waking world do no business in the graveyards of Upper Dreamland, leaving that the web-footed lamps are spawned of the dead cities. And many things intervene betwixt their gulf and the Enchanted Wood, including the terrible kingdom of the Gugs. The Gugs, hairy and gigantic, once reared stone circles in the wood and made strange sacrifices to the other gods in crawling chaos of Nyarlathotep. Until one night an abomination of theirs reached the ears of the earth's gods, and they were banished to the caverns below. Only a great trapdoor of stone with iron ring connects the abyss of the earth ghouls with Enchanted Wood, and this the Gugs are afraid to open because of the curse. That a mortal dreamer could traverse the cavern realm and leave by the door is inconceivable, for mortal dreamers were their former food, and they have legends of the toothsomeness of such dreamers, and even though banishment has restricted their diet to gas, those repulsive things which die in the light, and which live in the vaults of Zen, and leap out on long hind legs like kangaroos. So, the ghoul that was Pickman advised Carter either to leave the abyss at Sarkomand, that deserted city in the valley below, where black nitrous stairways, guarded by winged diorite lions, led down from the Dreamland to the lower gulfs, or to return through the churchyard to the waking world and begin the quest anew, down the 70 steps of light slumber to the cavern of flame, and the 700 steps to the gate of the deeper slumber, and to the Enchanted Wood. This, however, did not suit the seeker, for he knew nothing of the way, from Lang to Uth-Nargai, and was likewise reluctant to awake lest he forget all that he had so far gained in this dream. It were disastrous to his quest to forget the august and celestial faces, to those men from the north who traded onyx in the Cephas, and who, being sons of gods, must point the way to the cold waste in Kadath, where the great ones dwell. After much persuasion, the ghoul consented to guide his guest inside the great wall of the Gug's kingdom. There was one chance that Carter might be able to steal through the twilight realm of the circular stone towers at an hour when the giants would be all gorged and snoring indoors, and reach in the central tower, which is a sign of Koth open it, which has the stairs leading up from the stone trapdoor in the enchanted wood. Pikmin even consented to lend 3 ghouls to help with the tombstone lever in raising the stone door, for the Gugs are somewhat afraid, and they often flee from their colossal graveyards when they see feasting there. He also advised Carter to disguise as a ghoul himself, shaving the beard he had allowed to grow, for ghouls have none, wallowing naked in the mold to get correct surface, and loping in the unusual slumping way, with his clothing carried in a bundle as if it were a choice morsel from a tomb. They would reach the city of the Gugs, which coterminous with the whole kingdom, though through the proper barrows, emerging in a cemetery not far from the stair-containing tower of Koth. They must beware, however, a large cave near the cemetery, for this is the mouth of the vaults of Zen, and the vindictive gas were always on the watch there murderously for the denizens of the upper abyss, who hunt prey on them. The gas try to come out when the Gugs sleep, and they attack ghouls as readily as Gugs, for they cannot discriminate. They are a primitive people, and they eat another. The Gugs have a sentry at a narrow place in the vaults of Zen, but he is often drowsy and sometimes surprised by a party of gas. Though gas cannot live in a real light, they can endure in the grey twilight of the abyss for hours. So, at the length Carter crawled through endless burrows with 3 helpful ghouls bearing slate gravestone of Colonel Nehemiah Derby, obliterated in 1719 from the Charter Street burying ground in Salem. When they came again into open twilight, there was in a forest vast lichened monoliths, reaching nearly as high as the eye could see, forming the modest gravestones of the Gugs. On the right side of the hole, out which they wriggled, and seen through the aisles of monoliths, was a stupendous vista of cyclopean round towers, mounting up illimitable into the grey air of the inner earth. This was the great city of the Gugs, whose doorways 30 feet high. Ghouls come here often, for a buried Gug will feed an entire community for a year. And even with the added peril, it is better to burrow for Gugs than to bother with the graves of men. Carter now understood the occasional tightened bones he had felt beneath him in the Vale of Panath. Straight ahead, and just outside the cemetery, rose the sheer perpendicular cliff, at whose base immense and forbidding cavern yawned. This the ghouls told Carter to avoid as much as possible, since it was at the entrance of the unhallowed vaults of Zen, where Gugs hunt gas in the darkness. And truly, that warning was soon well justified, For the moment, a ghoul began to creep toward the towers to see if the hour of the Gug's resting had been roughly timed. There glowed in the gloom, that of the cavern's mouth, the first one pair of yellowish-red eyes, and then another, implying that the Gugs were 1 century less, in that gas have indeed an excellent sharpness of smell. So the ghoul returned to the burrow and motioned his companions to be silent. It was best to leave the gas to their own devices, and there was a possibility that they might soon withdraw, since they must naturally be either tired for having coping with the Gug sentry in the black vaults. After a moment, something about the size of a small horse hopped out into the gray twilight, and Carter turned sick at the prospect of that scabrous and unwholesome beast, whose face is so curiously human, despite the absence of a nose, a forehead, and other important particulars. Presently, 3 other gas hopped in to join their fellow, and a ghoul gibbered softly at Carter that their absence of battle scars was a bad sign. It proved they had not fought the Gug sentry at all, but merely slipped past them as he slept, so that their strength and savagery were still unimpaired and would remain so had they found the dispose of a victim. It was very unpleasant to see those filthy and disproportionate animals, which soon numbered about 15, grubbing about and making their kangaroo leaps into the gray twilight where Titan towers and monoliths arose. But it was still more unpleasant where they spoke themselves, coughing gutturals and gasps. And yet, horrible as they were not so horrible as what presently came out of the cave, after them with disconcerting suddenness. It was a paw, fully 2 feet and a half across, equipped with formidable talons. After it came another paw, and after then a great furred arm, to which both paws were attached by short forearms. Then 2 pink eyes shone, and the head of an awakened Gug sentry, large as a barrel, wobbled into view. The eyes jutted 2 inches from each side, shaded by bony protuberances, overgrown with coarse hairs. But the head was chiefly terrible because of the mouth. That mouth had great yellow fangs and ran from the top to the bottom of the head, opening vertically instead of horizontally. But before that unfortunate Gug could emerge from the cave and rise to his full 20 feet, the vindictive gas were upon him. Carter feared for a moment that he would give an alarm and rouse all of his kin, till a ghoul softly glibbered at that the Gugs have no voice, but talk by means of facial expression. The battle, which had then ensued, in a truly frightful one. From all sides the venomous gas rushed feverishly upon the creeping Gug, nipping and tearing with all their muzzles, and mauling murderously with their hard-pointed hooves. All of the time they coughed excitedly, screaming when the great vertical mouth of the Gug would occasionally bite some of their number, so that the noise of the combat would surely have aroused a sleeping city, had not the weakening of the sentry begun to transfer the action farther and farther within the cave. As it was, the tumult soon receded altogether from the sight of the blackness, with only occasional evil echoes mark its containance. Then, the most alert of the ghouls gave the signal for all to advance, and Carter followed the loping three of the forested monoliths into the dark, noisome streets of that awful city, whose rounded towers of cyclopean stone soared up beyond sight. Silently, they shambled over the rough rock pavements, hearing with disgust the abominable muffled snortings from great black doorways which marked the number of the Gugs. Apprehensive of the ending of the rest hour, the ghouls set a somewhat rapid pace, but even so, the journey was no brief one, for distances in that town of giants were of great scale. At last, however, they came to a somewhat open space, before a tower even vaster than the rest, above whose colossal doorway was fixed a monstrous symbol in a bas-relief, which made one shudder without knowing its meaning. This was the central tower with the sign of Koth, and those huge stone steps, just visible through the dusk within, were beginning of the great flight heading to the upper dreamland in the enchanted wood. There now began a climb of interminable strength in utter blackness, made almost impossible by the monstrous size of the steps, which were fashioned for Gugs, and therefore nearly a yard high. Of their number, Carter could form just no estimate, for he soon became so worn out that the tireless and elastic ghouls were forced to aid him. All through the endless climb, there lurked the peril of detection and pursuit. For though no Gug dares lift the stone door to the forest, because of the Great One's curse, there are no such restraints concerning the tower and the steps, and escaped ghasts are often chased even to the very top. So sharp are the ears of the Gugs that the bare feet and hands of the climbers might readily be heard when the city awoke, and it would, of course, take but little time for the striding of giants, accustomed from their ghast hunts in the vaults of Zen to seeing without light, to overtake their smaller and slower quarry on the cyclopean steps. It was very depressing to reflect that the silent pursuing of Gugs would not be heard at all, but would come suddenly and shockingly from the dark upon the climbers. Not could the fear of Gugs for ghouls be depended upon in the peculiar place where advantages lay so heavily without the Gugs. There was also some peril from the furtive and venomous gas, which frequently hopped up onto the tower during the sleep hour of the Gugs. If the Gugs slept long, and the gas returned soon from their deed in the cavern, the scent of the climbers might easily be picked up by those loathsome and ill-disposed beings, in which case it would almost certainly be better to be eaten by a Gug. Then, after eons of climbing, there came a cough from the darkness above, and matters assumed a very grave and unexpected turn. It was clear that a ghast, or perhaps even more, had strayed into that tower before coming to Carter and his guides, and it was equally clear that this peril was very close. After a breathless second, the leading ghoul pushed Carter to the wall and arranged his two kinsfolk in the best possible way, with the old slate tombstone raised for crushing blow whenever the enemy might come in sight. Ghouls can see in the dark, so the party was not so badly off as Carter would have been alone. In another moment, the clatter of hooves revealed the downward hopping of at least one beast, and the slab-bearing ghouls poised with the weapon for a desperate blow. Presently, two yellowish-red eyes flashed into view, and the panting of the gas became audible above its clattering. As it hopped down to the step above, the ghouls, they wielded the ancient gravestone with prodigious force, so that they were only a wheeze and a choking before the victim collapsed in a noxious heap. There seemed to be only this one animal, and after a moment of listening, the ghouls tapped Carter as to signal to proceed again. As before, they were obliged to aid him, and he was glad to leave the place of carnage, where the gas uncouth remains sprawled invisible in blackness. At last, the ghouls brought their companion to a halt, and, feeling above him, Carter realized the great stone trapdoor was reached at last. To open so vast a thing completely was not to be thought of, but the ghouls hoped to get it up just enough to slip the gravestone under a prop and permit Carter to escape through the crack. They themselves planned to descend again and return through the city of the Gugs, since their elusiveness was great, and they did not know a way overland to the spectral sarcomand with the lion-guarded gate to the abyss. Mighty was the straining of those three ghouls at the stone of the door above them. Carter helped push with as much strength as he had. They judged the edge next to the top of the staircase to be the right one, and to this they bent all the force of their disreputably nourished muscles. After a few moments, the crack of a light appeared, and Carter, to whom that task had been entrusted, slipped the end of the old gravestone into the aperture. There now ensued a mighty heaving, but progress was very slow, and they had, of course, to return to their very first position every time they failed to turn the slab to prop the portal open. Suddenly, their desperation was magnified 1,000-fold by a sound of steps below them. It was only the thumping and rattling of the swaying gas-hooved body as it rolled down the tower levels. But of all possible causes of that body's dislodgement in the rolling, none was in the least reassuring. Therefore, knowing the way of the Gugs, the ghouls set with something of a frenzy, and in a surprisingly short time had the door so high that they were able to hold it whilst Carter turned the slab and left a generous opening. They now helped Carter through, letting him climb with their rubbery shoulders, and later guiding his feet as he clutched at the blessed soil of the upper dreamland. Another second, and they were through themselves, knocking away the gravestone and closing the great trapdoor, whilst a panting became audible beneath. Because of the Great One's curse, no Gug might ever emerge from the portal. So with a deep relief and sense of repose, Carter lay quietly on the thick, grotesque fungi of the enchanted wood, while his guides squatted near in the manner that the ghouls rest. I'm going to stop it there. The story is not over, but I am about halfway through the story. This is actually probably my favorite story so far. It's very it's kind of easy to follow, and it's a really just interesting story, and it's very imaginative, and it's interesting that it's just taking place within a dream world, and yeah, very, very cool stuff. We've been going for about 2.5 hours, and It's not bad. I will continue the rest of the story next stream, which will be Sunday. Today is Thursday. I will continue it Sunday at 8 p.m. Central Time. And yep, I don't have much to say other than that. Thank you for joining, and hope you all enjoyed, and I will catch you all next stream. Thanks for coming.